Welcome back to the Mold Show. I'm your host, Adam Horn, with my co-host Sean McGrath. If you didn't tune into the first one or see any of our clips, I am a state of Florida licensed mold remediator, and Sean is a Florida licensed mold assessor. And in our first clip, we kind of went into what it means to be a remediator and a mold assessor. And today we want to kind of dig a little bit deeper on step number one. Where do we start? I think, Sean, you and I were talking earlier, and I think the question you and I often get, probably you more than me, is, do I have a mold problem? We briefly touched on that last time. So, when somebody comes to you with that question, where do they begin ultimately if they feel like they may have a mold situation?
Well, like you said, Adam, most people usually have no idea that they have a mold issue. They might have a suspicion that maybe they have a problem, but have no idea what's going on, where it's coming from. And, even if they do, they have no idea what that next step is, which
Right.
is where we come in. Yep. So, yeah, typically our clients are, they're calling us because maybe their friends or family or know the symptoms that they're dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe their doctor is thinking it could be something environmental based off of the testing they've seen in their clinicals.
Mm-hmm.
So they call us for us to do a deep dive and really figure out if the home is contributing. Now, it may not always be the root cause of why someone's feeling the way they do,
Right.
but I can tell you strong correlation with the mold exposure and potentially, exacerbating what anyone is already dealing with.
Yeah, and neither you or and I are medical professionals.
Right.
We leave that to people who have a lot more education than we do in regards to what exposures to toxins can do to you. But
The listeners will probably hear us say that a lot
yeah,
throughout this
yeah,
show.
I think it's fair to say, and it's not too much of a leap to say, that having the exposure, whether you're feeling the effects of it or not, probably isn't healthy.
Yeah.
And so, being in an environment, especially in an enclosed environment where it's growing in excess, probably isn't good for anyone, whether it's causing an effect you're aware of or not. So, I think that you get asked the question a lot, and I do too. And I ultimately, I don't know. We tell people, defer to the medical experts
Mhm.
out there. But we know it's nasty, can be nasty, and it affects everybody in some ways differently. And some people say it doesn't affect them at all. Maybe that's the case, but ultimately, it doesn't belong in an inside environment. I think we can all agree on that.
Yeah, and I think it's always a good idea if somebody is suspicious that their home, could be contributing.
Hmm.
If you have a place to go stay for a few nights, go do that and see if you feel any different. I think that's
Yeah,
a good um, starting point. It could be very telling, actually.
yeah, and sometimes those places that throw hotel rooms and things like that, they might also have mold.
That you're right. Yeah,
It's hard to get away from.
but I can't
Yeah,
tell you how often we're working with people, and
yeah,
in just a few nights away from the home,
yeah,
they notice a tremendous difference.
yeah. Often,
Not always going to be the case, because some people's immune systems are just so compromised that just removing themselves from a little bit of the exposure
yeah.
isn't going to do much. But
Sometimes it's the odor. We all become nose blind to the environments we occupy. You
mhm.
don't necessarily know you have, uh, you know, an odor in some cases until you're away. And when you come back, maybe the air's been stagnant in there, and then it becomes more prevalent, or you become more aware of the fact that you might have an odor in some cases. And I know from my experience, sometimes that's where it starts with people. They smell something. They smell it in their bathroom, they smell it in their laundry room, wherever the case may be. There is an odor in there. Some people it's unmistakable. People describe it in lots of different ways. I'm sure you've heard all types of things, earthy, wet towels,
Yeah.
wet dirt, whatever the case may be. Everybody's kind of got a different explanation for it. But
Hmm.
I tell people to trust their olfactory, to trust their their intuition, and because in a lot of cases it's right on. And so maybe once they have an idea that there could be an issue, what would be the next step in a lot of cases for a homeowner or business owner, somebody who's managing the building itself?
You know, I truly think one of the most important steps is that initial phone call, believe it or not. We take a lot of time. Well, Al takes a lot of time. He's the one doing most of those initial calls these days. But
For those who don't know, the company you work for, Certified Mold Assessments, and Al Rabin being the owner, and we're going to have him on guesting with us on one of our future episodes. You guys focus on the really the information collection, and then consulting with the homeowner to determine what suits them best. What is their next step? So I'm sorry, I mean to interrupt you. Just wanted to kind of set the basis for that. People who didn't know.
Yeah. We hope to have him on so he can go through that entire process, because those upfront calls, they can be pretty lengthy because we're trying to learn as much as we can about the situation,
Right.
Including what the overall concerns and objectives are from the client.
Right.
Are you calling us because you're concerned about your health? Is it just something you've noticed or smelled in the home? But the reason why that call is so long is we really want to know a lot of information about the history of the home,
Right.
as much as the client knows anyway. Nobody's got everything about the home, but usually, during that call, when you ask enough questions, people start to think, maybe there could be a problem here based off of everything we know has happened.
Yeah.
Sure, we may have addressed the source, but did we take the proper steps to, dry it out and or remediate?
Yeah, and I can tell you from my experience being out there in the field, especially if it's a home that you aren't the original owner of, who knows what you may find, in areas from future or past exposures, not future. Hopefully, no future exposure, past exposures. If they did have an event of some type, a water damage event of some type, was it mitigated properly? Was it dried properly? Did they take the right steps to prevent the growth in the first place? Or, due to whatever reason, lack of education, or just not even knowing that they have an exposure, was it ever remediated properly or corrected? And in a lot of cases, we find things that nobody was aware of just by accessing it. Or on the testing side, you guys gathering information and evasively or non-evasively, looking and inspecting visually and sampling and things like that to get answers.
Yeah, I think any company that you call really needs to spend a lot of time talking to the client up front. Any company that's only going to give you a few minutes of their time and doesn't truly want to understand the concerns and the history of the home probably isn't going to be very thorough once they get their boots on the ground and into your house.
Yeah, and I'm sure in some cases people know exactly what it is they're dealing with. There are times where people are aware that I had this flood event, right? My dishwasher has been leaking. I had a plumber out. It's clear we've had an exposure here, and moisture soaked into my cabinetry and behind the wall of the cabinets and potentially into the surrounding area. And at that point, they're very aware of the exposure. And when they come to you guys with that type of information, that's just the starting point in most cases, right?
It is. But once we actually get to the property, we take all those things into consideration. Of course, those are probably going to be areas we look at first. Try to expand our scope from there. But looking at the whole property, I mean, even the outside. Sometimes the outside gives us a lot of clues as to where to go inside. Cracked stucco.
Yep.
For water runoff, whether it's the gutters, the downspouts, different valleys in the roof.
Yeah.
Could point us to really important areas. And of course, once we get inside, we're looking for those markers as
Yeah.
well. And a lot of times, mention this in the kind of welcome or intro episode.
Yeah.
We're not even looking for mold, so to speak.
No.
We're looking for those signs and symptoms, if you will, of current or previous issues.
Right.
And hopefully we can get a video of this, but I think I sent you one today.
Yeah.
Really good example
Yep.
of in a kitchen, had two-tone between the cabinet and the kick plate,
Yeah.
which didn't look right. I don't think anybody's design choices are two different tone cabinets
No.
along the same wall.
Right.
And then when I looked under the sink, you could tell there'd been repairs with the different
Yeah.
tones in the walls around the cabinet. And sure enough, as we look further, there's a bunch of water damage and mold growth around that cabinetry, which never would have known had you just took a quick glance. You really got to look hard and then investigate around those areas as well.
Yeah. That's a great point, man. You know, it ultimately comes back to water damage in most cases, or moisture elevations.
Mhm.
And I think we've both been in enough properties where you open up underneath the kitchen sink and there's a completely different base under there, and you can tell somebody's been in there and knocked the base out and then replaced it with a piece of plywood or something like that. Those things sometimes get missed in the home purchasing. They bring in the home inspector, and home inspector's focusing on whatever they're hired to do, checking the house out structurally and electrical, and is the plumbing working, and some of the bigger things. And then in some cases completely missing perfectly obvious areas where there's been some type of event, a water damage event or an event of some type that's resulted in a repair. And like you're describing, that type of repair to me sets off all types of alarm bells. It's like, okay, so we know there's been, it's like a CSI and in a crime scene investigation in a lot of cases. Okay, clearly there's been an event here, and we have to gather information with the tools that we have, and in your case, gather information, using the cameras, using your visual assessment, and then in most cases, the sampling you take to really get some good information.
Yeah, when we see things like that, my first question is always why.
Yeah.
Why do things look like this? So we got to dive deeper to figure out. And there might not always be those obvious signs of why, but there's usually always a way that you can sample if you get creative to figure out what's going on behind it, beneath it, to the side of it. Just got to use your judgment. Best place to go to sample to get as much information for the client as possible.
What does this sampling tell us in most cases? Like you're taking these samples, different types of samples in different sampling methodologies. What's the purpose of that for people who don't know?
Yeah, well, how we test is really going to be dependent on that investigation stage. Once we get done going through the house, come up with a sampling plan. Bigger houses, we might sample as we go, just because if we wait till the end, it could be another 2 hours of sampling. So
right. Yeah.
It can be a lot of time. That doesn't always mean our client has to accept them all. It's ultimately up to them and how much data they want. But, there's a wide range of sampling methodologies, as you said. Probably most people that listen to this are going to be familiar with your typical air test, your ambient air samples, as we call them, where you set your tripod up in the middle of the room and it collects any mold spores, dust, dirt, debris that are floating around. We do collect those, but we are not totally dependent on those air samples. As you've learned over the years, as have we, those air samples are just a snapshot in time, if you will, of those 5 minutes in time that we're collecting the sample. Mold isn't always going to be aerosolized. So if we're just focusing on that, a lot of times it can give you this false sense of security that everything's okay. When it's just not the case. So we like to isolate a lot of our samples. We call them source samples, if you will, where we're going into wall cavities where we believe there could be something hiding, taking swabs of areas that could help us again isolate if there's issues in walls,
Yep.
under cabinets, around the air conditioning system, and so forth. So I truly believe the wall cavities and the swabs are the best for determining what your sources are.
Yeah, and I would tend to agree from a remediator's perspective because I see all kinds of, pre-reports, testing reports, um, where the air samples look similar to the outside air sample. But the areas that we ultimately end up removing, like let's just say it's a shower, for example, it may not visually look like there's an excessive amount of growth, and if it's not disturbed, it wouldn't necessarily make it into the air if it's trapped behind layers and layers of material, behind tile and behind the the board, the wall board, or in the insulation or growing on the framing. It may never had the opportunity to get into the air. It could still be producing more growth and more toxins and things like that, that wouldn't show up on your report unless it's disturbed. And in a lot of cases, we see that when somebody's in there disturbing it,
Yeah.
it definitely shows up in the air. So,
Yeah. Or if it's had a chance to dry out,
yeah,
we hear a lot that, I know what that source was that happened a long time ago. Everything's dry now, so it's fine. But sometimes that can be worse, because
right.
as those spore or those colonies start to dry out, spores can fragment. They
Yeah,
become lighter as they dry out, so it's easier to disturb them from the
yeah,
aerosolize, and it can
yeah,
actually be, a worse situation than if it were still, soaking wet, because a lot of times those spores are still kind of attached to the building material with the colony in those situations.
sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, yes. So back to you know, this scenario where somebody calls you out and you come in, you start the evaluation process, with the information you've gathered from them, and then you put together a sampling plan for them. What does it look like from there typically?
Well, after we perform the samples, of course, we've got to send everything off to a third party laboratory.
Okay.
That way, it's not our opinion or anything. It is what it is. We
Right.
send everything that's looked under the microscope by third party laboratory. But, given our inspection, which, could last anywhere from 3 to 8 hours, depending on the circumstances and how big the house is, how many sources there are, how
Yep.
much testing we perform.
Yep.
Once we get all that information back, we provide a very comprehensive inspection report.
Yep.
Includes all of our pictures, all of our comments of what we saw while we collected the sample, and ultimately the most important part for next steps is the remediation protocol.
Yeah.
That
And
really sets the tone and the roadmap for
mm,
a lot of really big decisions that the homeowners have to make, that you can't make the best decision for your family unless you have the full scope and can kind of prioritize what you need to attack.
yeah, and it's everything from a remediator's perspective, because otherwise we can only go based off visual cues. And in most cases, that's not even close to enough unless it's
Mm-hmm.
very obvious that there's been some type of exposure or there's visible or what appears to be visible growth. Because we can't even say necessarily that you have mold unless we have, documented laboratory evidence. In most cases, you'll probably hear that a lot if you're in and around this industry. People say appears to be until they get those lab reports back, which then gives you the actual evidence. And in some cases, that evidence not just you know for the remediator, but for the insurance companies, for all the other interested parties and involved. That really is like the justification in a lot of cases, for the need to do something about it. We'll probably go into several different episodes talking about the insurance process and how it all fits in, and give you our opinion and maybe some guidance in regards to that process. One thing you did mention earlier, and I would say it's understated in a lot of ways, but it's, you know, virtually the most important piece of the puzzle, or one of the most important pieces of the puzzle, is determining the source and correct, and then coming up with a plan to rectify the source. You know, and your inspection process helps out a ton. Knowing that there's an issue with building envelope, a window, or stucco on the exterior, or poor drainage on the outside of the house, or roof issues, you know, if it's visually evident, is extremely important, because it does point us in the right direction in a lot of cases. And then also is imperative that it's corrected, either, you know, pre remediation, during the remediation, or post remediation, depending on the type of exposure it is. Because if it's not corrected, it will continue to occur, and you'll continue to have the same problem over and over again. So that's extremely important in a lot of cases.
Yeah, well, I want to ask you because, you know, as we mentioned in the first episode, we travel all over the country,
Mm-hmm.
and usually we're the second, third, fourth inspection slash remediation company that client has turned to.
Yeah.
Usually a few failed remediations. So
Yeah.
how hard is it from the remediation side when you're only given a 2-3 page report with no pictures, no comments, just kind of some numbers from the lab and a short protocol to go off of?
You know, we can only go based on the knowledge we have, and until we start removing the material, we don't even know necessarily what the full scope and spectrum of it is. You said it perfectly earlier. The sampling is a snapshot. The more snapshots, the better idea we have initially of where we may find things. And so it definitely helps. So if I go in only knowing about one specific area, and I only have very limited information, like a few samples were taken in this one room, no clue what's going on in the rest of the home. And that puts me at a big disadvantage, and the homeowner or the building owner at a big disadvantage, because at that point we can only speculate. We can uh you know, do evasive inspection, but at that point we have to kind of treat every area like it's potentially contaminated.
Yeah, just guessing at that point.
Yeah, and that point you're guessing. So the sampling process is extremely helpful, because it does give us information we wouldn't normally get. I don't know what's behind that baseboard, and personally, as a remediator, I'm not gonna, you know, try to do anything, you know, extremely disruptive, because if there is an issue in there, I don't really want to mess with it. I'd rather prep the area and assume there is an issue if I don't have testing information. And that happens all the time. Some people say, I'm not doing it. I don't want to spend the money, or whatever the case,
Yep.
or they have a small sample from an assessor, and it's like, okay, what am I going to, this is great for this little area here, but you know, clearly I can see there's been visual signs of other exposures in other areas. And without knowing, I have to assume at that point that any area that we start to open up or cut into could potentially have exposures, and then we're in a chase situation. So, and then in those scenarios, you know, there's a lot of unwelcome surprises for people. I personally want to gather as much information, if it's me, the homeowner, and I don't and know anything about it. I want to know as much as I can, so I can prepare for what potentially needs to happen in order to correct the problem. And that goes for any trade, not just what we're talking about, you know.
Right. Yep.
Same with HVAC or plumbing or electrical. Like, give me the you know, the information, so I can make an educated decision in regards to how I'm going to handle this. Because in some cases, people decide to walk away. You know, I mean, we'll get into some of those scenarios later too, but
Mm-hmm.
you just don't know without gaining that information up front exactly what you're dealing with. And even with all the sampling, it can still not paint the full picture. Really, the remediation is going to expose, and the remediation is a fancy word for removal of the materials that the growth has occurred on, or the water damage is on. Most cases, cosmetic materials, not framing and structure, depending on what you find and expose when you're doing it. But there's plenty of cases where I never would have looked in that wall hadn't had the sample not come back, because visually it's great. 10, could have been painted over 10 times, or new baseboard could have been put in, and I wouldn't have no clue that window was leaking, because maybe it's not an active issue anymore. But then as we get into an area nearby, and we find, wow, what's going on here? Where did this come from? And then have to end up kind of chasing it without information. So it can be tough at times without knowing. That's for sure.
Well, even when we do know, there's still always going to be surprises. Unfortunately, I'm not Superman with X-ray vision, so
nobody is, by the way.
Still,
that
yeah,
doesn't exist.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't have the nanobot technology yet. For hopefully in the future, one day you just release them and they just crawl into every cavity everywhere and take all kinds of pictures and documentation. At that point, you may be out of a job.
Who knows? Maybe
or you manufacturing those nanobots. I'm getting off topic. Which is
maybe Elon Musk is already there.
Yeah, Elon. We have an idea, man.
But the reason I say that is it's just to stress how important it is to take your time, do your due diligence when trying to hire a remediation company.
Yes.
Because you have to find somebody that's going to take that information. Again, it's just a starting roadmap. And as they're opening up things, try to figure out what the source is for sure. Try to find consistencies with the damage that may lead to other areas that weren't found. Windows are a great example.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the contractors that install those windows, it's not just going to be one or two windows that are leaking. They're probably installed the others the same way.
Yeah.
So there's always going to be situations where things need to be chased or further looked into. And if you don't have a good remediation company, a lot of times those other steps aren't taken to figure that out.
Yeah, you're right. If you identify an issue in one area, windows are a great example. And there's clear signs of improper installation or whatever the case may be. Probably a good idea for you to look at all of them if it's feasible, because you could potentially have the same issue overall. Sometimes it's not the window, it's the stucco. It's the other trades that work in and around those areas, and they mess up in some way, or the siding company or whatever. That these days homes are built in phases, and it's usually different teams doing different jobs, and in some cases one team messes it up for everybody. So it doesn't matter the age necessarily of the home. In some cases it can be built wrong from day one. And if you're in a state like we are in Florida, where water's falling out of the sky half the year or more, then it's going to find its way in the right conditions or the wrong conditions, and then ultimately end up in having you contacting one of us. Hopefully it's not the case, but information is power, and the more you know about the process, and the better off you are, then you'll know where to look, and you can help guide the assessor or guide the remediator, or in some cases, if you're trying to correct the problem yourself, you'll have more information to help you correct the situation.
Yeah, and hopefully you find a company too that's going to kind of jump in head first as your consultant from there on out too.
Yeah.
You need somebody to kind of keep the remediation company in check, if you will. Especially after remediation. But it's also really important that there's this team aspect to the project, if you will, of the inspector and remediation company, working together.
Yeah.
Can't tell you how many times, egos kind of get involved. And from there, it's really hard to get the project right, meet the objective for the client. So really important that relationship is strong.
Yeah, it has to be. If you're in this boat, and you find yourself in a situation where you have testing done, you get the results back and the report back, and you need remediation. You're in for a project, and there are lots of moving parts and lots of moving people. The testing and assessment is usually the tip of the sword, and the remediator is just the next step. And then, the remediator is likely going to be working in conjunction with your contractor, your HVAC contractor, or whatever contractors are responsible for correcting the source issues. And it has to work as a unit, and building good relationships and finding good contractors is very difficult to do. We're assuming that you're in an area where you even have access to these types of resources. And in a lot of cases, you might not have any access to resources. There might not be a remediation company anywhere near you. You could live in a rural area or a different part of the US, or if you're listening from outside the US, and you feel like you've had some type of exposure and you don't know what to do. So I say, ultimately, in some cases, some people may have to do this themselves, or some people may want to do it themselves. And in those cases, and I'm sure you and I will talk a lot more about that, especially when we go into the remediation process and what something like that looks like. I'm not opposed to having that discussion in regards to the do-it-yourselfers out there, because there's plenty of them. I think in most cases, I think the majority of these projects are probably done, but we never even hear about by the homeowner, or the homeowner or somebody in the homeowner's family. And then I know there's plenty of cases where you and I will go in after that because they don't know what they're doing. They didn't try to gather the information, or they just hired, Johnny, the handyman, to do it, and Johnny made a big mess. And
Johnny made it worse.
Johnny made it way worse. So we're gonna jump into a lot of those scenarios.
There's no Johnny the handyman. Just
so Johnny's he's not invited on the show. I mean, Johnny, if you want to call in, man, you're watching this and you can educate yourself. But that's what we're here for. We don't have all the answers. We want to hear from you as well. If there are scenarios that you're currently dealing with, or you're in that question phase, like, where do I start? What do I do? Because every scenario is completely different. Like, what do you do if you're a renter? What do you do if you live in an apartment complex? What if you do if it's in the building that you work in, your school, or the building your child works in, or the daycare center? All those things have all those scenarios have different answers. And hopefully we can guide you. It doesn't always have to be a one-way thing here. We want to encourage people to get involved and leave a comment. Hopefully you like and subscribe, because we're doing this because we want to help others. We see it go wrong way more than it goes right, and it's frustrating at times. And that's why we're here, man.
You're exactly right. Yeah, work with people in all those situations,
Right.
which, depending on your situation, is it's gonna be approached differently.
Yeah.
From a sampling standpoint, from a remediation standpoint, from a, do I just get up and move standpoint? So, but without the testing and having that information, really don't know how to guide somebody of what the best next step is for them, and their family.
It's to me, it's everything, because you have the documentation, and it gives the companies that are involved, or yourself, the roadmap to where to start. And that's important, because if you go in blindly, you're probably going to make some mistakes, and you're probably not going to protect your home, or the areas, or in and around the area that may have the exposure. And you could pay dearly because of that. Just doing it wrong in the first place can cause way more issues than just leaving it alone in some cases. So yeah. Well, I can't wait to do more, man. I think me and you could talk for another 2 hours. And
easy, but let's save some content for later.
Yeah, no, for sure. Later. Like I said, we'd love to answer some of your questions. Again, we encourage you to comment or email us. And all that information is in our bio. and tune in for the next one, and maybe we'll answer some of your questions. I know that we talked about having, some prospective clients on, as well as some current and maybe former clients to come on and talk about their experience with it, and get some of the people who are even smarter than us out there to
For sure.
some guidance too, because this is a learning process. Been doing this 20 plus years, and every job is like a new adventure. So yeah, I mean,
Yeah, we're good at our little avenue that
yeah,
we're responsible for, but
right.
like we were talking about before, it takes a team effort and
It does. Yeah,
a
we're just
lot of
a piece of the pie.
yeah. And so there's a lot of different moving parts, as you mentioned, and there are a lot of different people that are needed.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
All right, see you next time.